A German shepherd lay across the old woman's porch, as if the wooden steps belonged to her. For 3 days she refused to leave. She would not enter the house. She barely touched the food left beside her. And every afternoon she walked the same road out of town, only to return before dark. The old woman insisted she had never seen the dog before, but a 47-year-old former Navy SEAL living across the street noticed something no one else did. Why did the German shepherd keep staring at the same doorway? Why did she return at exactly the same time each day? And what would happen when the Navy SEAL found an old collar carrying a name the woman had spent years trying not to remember? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Early June had settled gently over Cedar Hollow, West Virginia, bringing warm mornings, pale skies, and the clean smell of wet grass drifting down from the wooded hills. Overnight rain still clung to the maple leaves along Hawthorne Street, and thin ribbons of water ran beside the curb beneath modest houses, built close enough for neighbors to notice one another, but far enough apart to preserve the illusion of privacy. Margaret Ellis had spent years becoming very good at that illusion. At 75, Margaret was a slender woman of medium height with narrow shoulders, fair skin softened by age, and silver-gray hair cut neatly just below her ears. Her blue eyes remained sharp, though the fine lines around them made her look more severe than she truly was. Margaret had once been known for remembering birthdays, baking pies for new neighbors, and keeping a spare key for anyone foolish enough to lock themselves out. Widowhood had made her more self-reliant, but something else, something she rarely discussed, had made her guarded. These days she was polite without being inviting, helpful without becoming close, and skilled at ending conversations before they reached places she did not want to visit. That morning, Margaret opened her front door expecting to collect the newspaper. Instead, a German shepherd was lying across the weathered boards of her porch. Margaret stopped with one hand still around the brass doorknob. The dog was an older female, perhaps 9 years old, large and lean without appearing underfed. Her coat was the rich black and tan typical of the breed, with a dark saddle across her back and silver beginning to gather around her muzzle. Her paws were dusty but not injured. Her brown eyes were clear and attentive, and one ear stood perfectly straight while the other angled outward slightly, lending her a thoughtful, almost questioning expression. She wore no collar. Nothing about her suggested panic. She was not panting, trembling, whining, or scanning the street for an owner. She simply looked at Margaret. "Well," Margaret said after several seconds, "this is awkward." The German shepherd blinked. "You are sitting where my newspaper should be." The dog did not move. Margaret glanced toward the quiet street. No one was calling for a missing pet. No vehicle idled nearby. A sprinkler clicked on 3 houses down, sending silver arcs across a lawn. Somewhere a screen door slammed. Margaret looked back at the dog. "You appear surprisingly calm for someone trespassing before breakfast." Sadie lowered her chin onto her front paws. Margaret did not know the dog's name, of course. To her, Sadie was simply an unexpected animal occupying the porch with the confidence of someone who had paid property taxes there for years. Margaret went inside and returned with a ceramic bowl of water and a plate containing pieces of roasted chicken from the previous evening. Sadie rose as soon as the water touched the porch. She drank deeply, then sniffed the chicken once and turned away. Margaret stared at the untouched food. "I cooked that myself." Sadie looked toward the open doorway. That was not a compliment. Margaret stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Fine. Come inside." Sadie stood. For one moment, Margaret thought the matter was settled. Then the German shepherd backed down a single step. Margaret frowned. "You were very determined to reach the porch 5 minutes ago." Sadie remained below the threshold. Margaret moved farther into the hallway. The dog climbed back onto the porch and lay down in exactly the same place. Something about the precision of it unsettled Margaret. A frightened animal might hesitate at a strange doorway. A lost dog might stay near a person offering food. But Sadie did neither in the usual way. She did not seem to want shelter, and she did not seem particularly interested in Margaret's kindness. She seemed interested in Margaret herself. Across the street, Nathan Cole had been watching from the front window of the house he rented. At 47, Nathan carried the unmistakable physical discipline of a man who had spent most of his adult life being trained not to waste movement. He stood a little over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders with a lean waist and strong arms, though an old injury had left his right shoulder slightly stiff on cold mornings. His dark brown hair was clipped short, gray spreading at the temples, and a neatly trimmed beard followed the angular line of his jaw. A thin, pale scar ran near his right temple. His hazel eyes were calm enough to make strangers assume he was relaxed. People who knew military men better might have noticed that Nathan rarely sat with his back to a door and almost never entered a room without glancing at every exit. 22 years in the Navy, most of them in the SEAL teams, had made those habits practical. The years afterward had made them difficult to turn off. Nathan had rented the small house opposite Margaret's less than a month earlier. He kept mostly to himself, repaired things that were not urgently broken, and answered personal questions with enough courtesy to discourage a second attempt. The neighbors assumed he valued solitude. Nathan knew the truth was less noble. Solitude meant fewer people asking what came next. He had once been certain about decisions. That confidence had ended during his final deployment. A military working dog had hesitated at an entry point, refusing to advance even when the handler urged it forward. Nathan had noticed but trusted the intelligence report indicating the route was clear. Time had mattered. He had made the call, the warning had been real. One teammate had been injured. The dog had survived but sustained damage severe enough to end its working career. Nathan's superiors had told him the decision was reasonable with the information available. No disciplinary action followed. No one accused him of carelessness. Nathan had discovered that forgiveness offered by other people did not always reach the person who needed it most. Since then, he had become uneasy whenever instinct and evidence pointed in different directions. The German shepherd on Margaret's porch brought that uneasiness back immediately. By late morning, Margaret had called Cedar Hollow Animal Control. A white county truck stopped beside the curb, and Calvin Reese climbed out carrying a slip lead. Calvin was 52, stocky and broad through the middle, with thinning sandy hair, sun-reddened cheeks, and the patient expression of a man who had spent 15 years being blamed for the behavior of other people's animals. He had a mild sense of humor and the useful ability to remain cheerful around both frightened dogs and irritated homeowners. He crouched several feet from Sadie. "Good morning," Calvin said. Margaret folded her arms. "I already tried conversation. Maybe she prefers county employees. If so, she has questionable taste." Calvin smiled and extended one hand low. Sadie sniffed his fingers and allowed him to examine her paws, shoulders, and ears. There were no obvious injuries. No identification chip could be checked without taking her to the shelter, and there was no collar hidden beneath the thick fur around her neck. "She's in decent condition," Calvin said. "Somebody's been caring for her." "Then somebody should resume doing it." Nathan had walked across the street by then. Margaret noticed him immediately. "Mr. Cole." "Mrs. Ellis." Her eyes moved toward his house. "Nothing left to repair?" "Plenty." "And yet here you are." Nathan ignored the invitation to retreat. His attention remained on Sadie. "Has she tried leaving?" he asked. Margaret looked mildly offended. "I assure you I have not restrained her." "That wasn't what I asked." Margaret's gaze sharpened. Nathan had spent enough time around guarded people to recognize when another question would only strengthen the wall. He looked at Calvin instead. "Act like a stray to you?" Calvin considered it. "Not really. She's calm, knows people, knows a leash." He slipped the lead gently around Sadie's neck. The dog stood without resistance. Calvin led her down the steps. Sadie looked back at Margaret. They crossed the walkway. Sadie looked back again. At the edge of the lawn, she slowed until Calvin gave a light encouragement on the lead. She continued, but every few steps her head turned toward the porch. Nathan watched more closely. The dog was not afraid of Calvin. She was not trying to escape. She was making certain Margaret was still there. Calvin opened the rear compartment of the county truck. Sadie stopped. "Come on, girl." The dog planted her paws. Calvin waited, then adjusted the lead. Sadie shifted backward, twisted with sudden speed, and slipped through the loosened loop before he could react. "Hey!" Sadie ran past Nathan, crossed the lawn, bounded up the porch steps, turned once, and lowered herself onto the same weathered board where Margaret had first found her. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Calvin stared at the empty lead in his hand. "Well," he said, "I've been rejected more politely." Margaret did not smile. Nathan looked from Sadie to Margaret. The German shepherd's attention was fixed on the old woman, not on the food, not on the house generally, on Margaret. "She isn't looking for shelter," Nathan said. Margaret turned toward him. "She is lying on my porch. That doesn't mean that's why she came." Margaret's mouth tightened. "Then why did she come?" Nathan watched Sadie's eyes move toward the doorway, then back to Margaret. "I think she's waiting for you to do something." The answer seemed to disturb Margaret more than he expected. "You know nothing about me, Mr. Cole." "I didn't say I did." "Good." Margaret went inside. Calvin agreed to check nearby missing dog reports before attempting another removal. Margaret insisted that leaving the dog temporarily did not make her responsible for it. 10 minutes after Calvin drove away, she replaced the water with a clean bowl. By afternoon, the sky had turned gray, heavy with another summer storm. Margaret stood behind the front curtain more often than she would have admitted. When the first rain began tapping against the porch roof, she brought out an old bath towel and spread it near the wall, where the boards were driest. "This is not permanent," she told Sadie. Sadie placed one paw on the towel. Margaret sighed. "You are a very rude guest." Night came with harder rain. Wind pushed water beneath the porch roof, dampening Sadie's back and darkening the fur along her shoulders. Margaret opened the door. "Come inside." Sadie lifted her head. "Do not make me repeat myself to a dog." Sadie rose and approached the doorway. Then she stopped. Instead of entering, she scratched once at the wooden threshold. Margaret looked down. Sadie turned, walked down the porch steps, and moved several yards toward Hawthorne Street. At the edge of the yard, the German shepherd stopped. She looked back. Margaret stood beneath the porch light. Across the street, Nathan had stepped outside. The rain fell between them in silver lines. Sadie waited. Margaret took one small step beyond the doorway, then stopped. Something tightened in her chest, an old instinct that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the terrible possibility that following sometimes meant finding what a person had spent years avoiding. She did not move again. Sadie remained by the road for several more seconds. Then the German shepherd lowered her head, turned back, climbed the porch steps, and settled onto the wet towel. Margaret stood silently in the doorway. She could have called the dog inside again. She did not. After a long moment, she closed the door, softly. Outside, Sadie remained beneath the summer rain, facing the house, and across Hawthorne Street, Nathan Cole watched the old dog settle her head between her paws. Whatever Sadie wanted, she had asked Margaret for it twice. Margaret had refused, and still the German shepherd stayed. The morning after the storm, Cedar Hollow looked freshly washed beneath a soft June sky. Rainwater still clung to the maple leaves along Hawthorne Street, and the green hills beyond town seemed unusually close in the clear air. Margaret Ellis opened her front door expecting, perhaps hoping, that the old German shepherd would finally be gone. Instead, the dog was lying on the same weathered boards, her silvered muzzle between her paws, one ear upright and the other tilted slightly outward. Margaret replaced the bowl of water without comment. Only after straightening did she glance down and say, "You are becoming remarkably comfortable for someone who was never invited." The dog blinked once. Margaret took that as an argument. Across the street, Nathan Cole watched from the front window of his rented house. He had slept badly again. Sleep had become less a nightly habit than a negotiation his body frequently refused. At 47, the former Navy SEAL was accustomed to discomfort, but there was something humiliating about being exhausted by memories no one else could see. He had spent part of the night thinking about the German Shepherd standing in the rain, looking back at Margaret as though expecting her to follow. The behavior bothered him because it had purpose. Working dogs did not waste energy without reason, especially older ones. That afternoon, Nathan received the first real clue. At exactly 4:15, the German Shepherd stood. No one called her, no car stopped, no whistle came from down the street. She simply stretched her aging hind legs, descended the porch steps, crossed Margaret's yard, and began walking east along Hawthorne Street. Nathan checked his watch. 4:15. The dog moved steadily, not quickly. Age showed in the slight stiffness of her left hind leg when she stepped off the curb, but she never wandered. She passed the small Baptist church at the corner, crossed beneath two old sycamores, and entered Cedar Hollow Park. Nathan followed only as far as the next intersection. He told himself he was curious. He had spent enough years questioning other people to know when someone was lying. That included himself. The dog disappeared beyond the park. At 6:07 that evening, she returned. Margaret was clipping dead blossoms from her hydrangeas when the German Shepherd walked through the gate and climbed the porch steps. Margaret looked up. "You've been somewhere." Nathan, standing across the street with a screwdriver in one hand, nearly laughed. The dog drank from her bowl. Margaret folded her arms. "You could at least pretend to feel guilty?" The following afternoon, the same thing happened. At precisely 4:15, the German Shepherd left. This time, Nathan followed. He stayed roughly 30 yards behind, enough distance to avoid making the animal feel chased. The dog followed the same route through the park, past the public library, then turned onto Mill Creek Road, which curved toward the northern edge of town. Nathan deliberately slowed. The dog continued another 20 yards, then stopped. She turned her head, looked directly at him. Nathan stopped too. The German Shepherd waited. When Nathan started walking again, she continued. He tested her at the next corner, same result. Nathan let more distance open between them. The dog stopped, checked behind her, and waited patiently until he caught up. "You're keeping track of me," Nathan murmured. One ear flicked backward at his voice. The farther north they walked, the quieter Cedar Hollow became. The neat sidewalks disappeared. Houses stood farther apart, separated by patches of woodland and overgrown lots. The mountains rose green beyond the road, and cicadas filled the warm afternoon with their steady electric hum. After nearly a mile, the German Shepherd reached an old service lane half covered by weeds. She stopped. Nathan expected her to continue. Instead, she stared farther north for several seconds. Then she turned around. Nathan frowned. "That's it?" The dog walked past him toward town. Nathan followed, more intrigued than frustrated. The next day, her route changed only because road workers had blocked the sidewalk near the library. The German Shepherd did not hesitate. She turned down a side street, passed behind an old pharmacy, and rejoined Mill Creek Road 2 blocks later. That detail mattered. Nathan had originally wondered whether the dog was following an old scent trail. Now he knew better. A scent trail could disappear. This dog knew where she was going. That evening, Nathan drew the route on the back of a hardware receipt. Hawthorne Street, Cedar Hollow Park, Mill Creek Road, Northern Service Lane. There was a destination somewhere beyond the final point. But for some reason, the dog always turned back before reaching it. Margaret continued insisting none of this interested her. Her actions were becoming increasingly poor evidence for that claim. On the third afternoon, Nathan saw Margaret standing behind the living room curtain at 4:14. At 4:15, when the dog left, Margaret looked toward the mantel clock. When the German Shepherd returned at 6:11, Margaret was already on the porch. "You're late," she told the dog. Nathan happened to be collecting his mail. 4 minutes. Margaret turned sharply. "Were you timing her?" "No." "You just happen to know she's 4 minutes late?" Nathan glanced through Margaret's open front door toward the clock. "So do you." Margaret stared at him. Nathan decided 22 years of military service had not prepared him for everything and returned to his own yard. Earlier that morning, Margaret had visited Dawson's Market near the town square. She normally moved through the store quickly, but she spent nearly 10 minutes in the pet food aisle reading labels before choosing a bag formulated for senior dogs with aging joints. At the register sat Evelyn Price, a woman in her early 60s who had worked at Dawson's for nearly 20 years. Evelyn was short, broad through the hips, with curly white blonde hair, a round, friendly face, and oversized red glasses. She had the cheerful curiosity of someone who had lived in a small town long enough to consider privacy more of a suggestion than a rule. "I didn't know you had a dog," Evelyn said. "I don't." Evelyn looked at the large bag of senior dog food, then back at Margaret. "It's for a neighbor." "Which neighbor?" Margaret placed a box of tea on the counter. "A hungry one." Evelyn smiled. Margaret did not. At least, not until she had turned away. By the 4th afternoon, Nathan was waiting before the German Shepherd rose. At 4:15 she stood. Nathan stepped from his porch. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see where you're trying to take me." The dog looked at him once and started walking. They followed the familiar route through town. The day had grown hotter, and Nathan noticed the German Shepherd moving more slowly than before. Her back remained strong, but the stiffness in her hindquarters became more obvious on inclines. Still, she showed no confusion. They passed the park, reached Mill Creek Road, then the old service lane. This time she continued farther. Nathan felt his attention sharpen. The road narrowed beneath heavy trees. An aging delivery truck came around the bend from the opposite direction, its suspension rattling loudly. Nathan barely noticed it until the engine backfired. The crack split the afternoon. Nathan stopped instantly. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. His shoulders locked, his breath caught high in his chest. For one disorienting moment, Cedar Hollow disappeared beneath sensations without complete images, pressure, shouting, metal, the terrible certainty that he had overlooked something important. His right hand clenched. The truck continued down the road. Nathan remained frozen. He hated this part more than the memories themselves, the helplessness. For most of his adult life, Nathan had been the person other people looked toward when something went wrong. He had made decisions while exhausted, injured, frightened, and uncertain. Now, a harmless mechanical backfire on a summer afternoon could steal command of his own lungs. "Come on," he whispered. His body ignored him. Then he saw the German Shepherd. She had come back. The dog sat about 6 feet in front of him, close enough to be present, but not close enough to crowd him. She did not bark. She did not paw at him. She simply watched. Her ears remained relaxed. Her brown eyes stayed fixed on Nathan's face. Nathan forced himself to focus on her. The dark mask around her eyes, the silver along her muzzle, the rhythm of her breathing. One breath entered his lungs, then another. His fist loosened. The pressure in his chest gradually eased. The German Shepherd stood. She walked 3 steps, then looked back. Nathan released a shaky breath that almost became a laugh. "Yeah," he said, "I'm coming." Only then did she continue. Something had changed between them. Nathan had spent several days believing he was studying the dog. Now he understood the dog had been studying him too. They walked another half-mile before reaching an old split-rail fence bordering an overgrown property. Tall summer grass pressed against the weathered wood. A collapsed shed leaned beneath a broad oak tree, and beyond it lay dense brush. The German Shepherd slowed. She sniffed along several fence posts. At one particular section beneath the oak, she stopped for nearly a minute. Nathan waited. The dog looked beyond the fence, then at Nathan. Then she turned back toward Cedar Hollow. Nathan stared after her. "Tomorrow?" The dog did not answer. By the time they returned to Hawthorne Street, they were nearly 10 minutes later than usual. Margaret was standing at her front gate, not casually, waiting. The moment she saw the German Shepherd, her shoulders relaxed. Then she noticed Nathan walking behind and immediately rearranged her face into something closer to irritation. "Where have you been?" Nathan looked at the dog. "You realize she can't answer." "I wasn't speaking to you." The German Shepherd passed through the gate. Margaret immediately brought fresh water. Nathan noticed that for a woman determined not to care, Margaret Ellis had developed an impressive number of habits around the animal. The following afternoon, Nathan went north alone before 4:15. He wanted to inspect the old fence more carefully. He reached the leaning oak and pushed through the waist-high grass. Rusted wire had been strung between two damaged posts. Something brown hung from one strand. Nathan pulled it free. It was an old leathered dog collar. The leather was cracked from weather and nearly split beside the buckle. No metal identification tag remained. Nathan turned it over. At first he saw only dirt, then faint letters appeared beneath his thumb. He rubbed away the grime. Sadie. Nathan stared at the name, so the German Shepherd finally had an identity. He cleaned the leather farther. A second line slowly became readable. Laura Ellis. Nathan stopped. Ellis. His thoughts immediately returned to Margaret. "I have never seen that dog before." Nathan looked south toward Cedar Hollow. He did not wait for the usual afternoon walk. When he reached Hawthorne Street, Margaret was sweeping the porch. There were barely enough leaves to justify the broom. The German Shepherd lay nearby. She noticed the collar before Margaret did. Her head rose. Nathan approached the porch. "Mrs. Ellis?" Margaret kept sweeping. "What now?" "I found something." Nathan held out the collar. Margaret glanced at it. The broom stopped. Nathan turned the leather so the faded writing faced her. The dog stood. Margaret read the first name, Sadie, then the second, Laura Ellis. The color drained from Margaret's face. Her fingers tightened around the broom handle. Nathan watched her carefully. There was no confusion in her eyes. Recognition came too quickly. For 4 days, Margaret had insisted the German Shepherd meant nothing to her. Now she stared at Sadie as though 11 years had suddenly crossed the road and climbed onto her porch. Margaret's lips parted. For several seconds she said nothing. Then one word escaped in a whisper. "Laura." Sadie stood completely still. And for the first time since arriving at the house, the old German Shepherd took one slow step toward Margaret. The afternoon heat lingered over Cedar Hollow, West Virginia, after Nathan Cole placed the cracked leather collar in Margaret Ellis's hands. Beyond Hawthorne Street, thunderheads were gathering over the green hills, but the neighborhood itself remained strangely still. Margaret stood on the porch with the broom forgotten against her skirt, staring at the faded words pressed into the leather. Sadie, Laura Ellis. Sadie had risen beside her. The old German Shepherd did not jump, bark, or demand attention. She simply took one slow step closer. Margaret moved backward. It was such a small reaction that another person might have mistaken it for surprise. Nathan did not. He had spent too many years watching people discover that something they believed buried had merely been waiting. "Laura," Margaret whispered again. The name sounded unnatural in her mouth, as though it had not been spoken there for a very long time. Sadie's ears lifted. Margaret noticed. That recognition frightened her more than the collar. Nathan said nothing at first. Silence had once been a professional tool for him. People often rushed to fill it, especially when the truth made them uncomfortable. Margaret did not rush. She looked down at the collar, then toward Sadie, and for several seconds her face seemed to lose the hard arrangement she had carefully maintained since Nathan met her. At 75, Margaret had become skilled at making vulnerability resemble irritation. Now she simply looked old. Not weak, not helpless. old in the deeper sense of carrying too many years that could no longer be changed. "You knew the name," Nathan finally said. Margaret lifted her eyes. "Of course I knew the name. Laura Ellis. My daughter." Nathan had already suspected as much. Hearing it aloud still changed the weight of the moment. Sadie stepped closer again. Margaret tightened her grip on the collar. She was Laura's dog. There it was, the first admission. Nathan glanced at Sadie. "How long ago?" 11 years. Margaret turned toward the door. Nathan expected her to disappear inside and close it. Instead, she paused. "If you're going to stand there asking questions, you might as well do it somewhere the neighbors can't enjoy themselves." It was the closest thing to an invitation Nathan had received from her. Inside, Margaret's house was as orderly as he imagined it would be. Pale curtains, polished wooden furniture, framed landscapes, nothing left casually where it might reveal too much about the person living there. Sadie remained outside the threshold. Margaret noticed, but did not ask her in again. Nathan took a chair beside the front window, rather than the upholstered seat facing the wall. Margaret noticed that too. "You always sit where you can see the door?" she asked. "Usually." "That sounds exhausting." "It can be." Margaret sat opposite him and placed the collar on the coffee table. For a while she looked at it rather than Nathan. "Laura was 39 when she left," Margaret said. Taller than me. Too thin because she forgot meals whenever she thought something mattered more. Chestnut brown hair almost to her shoulders. Gray-blue eyes like her father's, though she had my temper. Margaret paused. "Actually, that isn't fair. She had her own." The faintest hint of humor disappeared almost as soon as it appeared. Laura, as Margaret described her, had been the sort of woman strangers often underestimated because her voice was quiet. She was slender, fair-skinned, with a narrow, expressive face, and a habit of pushing loose hair behind one ear when she was thinking. She rarely raised her voice, which made it more unsettling when she did. As a child, Laura had brought injured birds into the kitchen, stray cats into the garage, and once a confused elderly man from 3 blocks away into the dining room because he could not remember where he lived. Margaret had considered that compassion charming when Laura was 10. It became less charming when Laura grew into an adult who refused to look away from other people's problems. "She became a social worker," Margaret said. "Worked at a senior care center here in town." Nathan remained quiet. "She liked old people." Margaret's mouth tightened. Perhaps liked isn't the right word. She listened to them. That was rarer. 11 years earlier, Laura had begun noticing problems at the facility. Residents left too long without assistance, complaints dismissed as confusion, families being told that bruises, missed meals, or unanswered call buttons were simply unfortunate parts of caring for elderly people. Laura started writing things down, dates, names, shifts. She wanted to report the neglect beyond the center's management. Margaret had told her not to. Nathan leaned back slightly. "Why?" The answer came too quickly. "Because Cedar Hollow was different then." "That doesn't answer the question." Margaret's eyes sharpened. Nathan waited. She looked away first. "My husband had been dead only 2 years. Our family had lived here for generations. I knew people on the center's board. I knew their wives, their children. We went to the same church. People trusted that place." "And you thought Laura would embarrass them?" "I thought she was accusing people before she understood how complicated things were." Nathan heard the sentence for what it was, something repeated often enough to become a shelter. Margaret continued. "I told her to handle it internally, give management time. She said they'd already had time." "What did you think she wanted?" "To prove she was right." The answer left Margaret's mouth, and regret immediately followed it. Nathan understood that kind of regret. Some sentences remained sharp years after the argument that created them. Their last fight had happened in the kitchen. Margaret did not dramatize it. That made it worse. Laura had come home carrying a folder thick with notes. Margaret had already heard whispers around town. Someone at church asked whether her daughter was having trouble at work. A neighbor mentioned that several employees might lose their jobs if Laura kept making accusations. Margaret felt watched, judged, embarrassed. Fear had dressed itself as practicality. She told Laura she was destroying relationships over matters she could not fix. Laura replied that relationships protecting bad behavior were not worth protecting. Margaret accused her daughter of enjoying conflict. Laura stared at her for a long time. Then she said, "The worst thing isn't doing something wrong, Mom. It's seeing something wrong and deciding your comfort matters more." Margaret's hands tightened in her lap. "I told her if she thought so little of me, she should stop coming to my house." Nathan looked toward the porch. Sadie was visible through the screen door, lying with her head raised. "And she did," he said. Margaret nodded. A few days later, Laura left Cedar Hollow with Sadie. Margaret told herself it was temporary. Then a month passed. Then 6. Then years. Letters began arriving. "At first, maybe 3 or 4 a year," Margaret said. "Then less." "You answered, no." "You read them?" Margaret's silence answered first, "No." Nathan stared at her. "Not one? No." "Why keep them?" The question seemed to hurt more than accusation would have. Margaret stood and walked toward the window. "Because throwing them away felt cruel." Nathan looked at her back. "But opening them didn't?" Margaret turned. There was anger in her face now, but it had nowhere useful to go. "You think I don't know what that sounds like?" "I think you've spent 11 years making it sound like something else." Her eyes flashed. "You don't know what was in those letters." "Neither do you." That stopped her. Nathan did not enjoy the victory. There was none. He knew how people survived unbearable choices. They edited them. A missed warning became bad intelligence. A daughter leaving became a daughter abandoning her mother. An unopened letter became protection from another argument. Given enough years, the revised version could feel more real than what actually happened. He had done it too. That was why he did not judge Margaret as easily as he might have once. But understanding a lie did not make it truth. Nathan looked toward Sadie. "You said Laura never came back." "She didn't." "Sadie knows the northern road." Margaret frowned. "She knows how to get from somewhere north of town to your porch," Nathan continued. "She isn't guessing. She's done that route before." Margaret's face tightened again. Nathan watched the implication reach her. "No," she said. "You don't know that. She left 11 years ago. And Sadie came back." Margaret shook her head. "That proves nothing." "Maybe." Nathan leaned forward. "But not reading the letters doesn't mean whatever Laura wrote never happened." The room became very quiet. Margaret looked toward the hallway. Nathan followed her gaze. "What?" She did not answer. Instead, Margaret walked upstairs. Nathan remained where he was. Sadie rose outside and moved closer to the screen door, but still did not cross the threshold. Several minutes passed. Then Margaret returned carrying a wooden box. It was cedar, darkened by age, with brass hinges and a small scratch across the lid. She set it on the coffee table. Nathan looked at her. Margaret opened it. Inside were envelopes, many of them, different stamps, different postmarks. Laura Ellis written in the return addresses, in the same narrow handwriting. Nathan counted without touching them. 17. Margaret sat down again. "I told myself I would open them when I was less angry." Her voice had become quieter. "Then I told myself too much time had passed." Nathan picked up the envelope on top only after Margaret nodded permission. The postmark was 4 years old. He turned it over, then looked at Margaret. The return address was not another state, not another county. It was Cedar Hollow, West Virginia. Margaret stared at it as if the envelope had changed while sitting unopened in the darkness. For 11 years she had told herself Laura had left. But 4 years ago her daughter had mailed a letter from the same town. Laura Ellis had come home. And Margaret had never known. Morning light entered Margaret Ellis's living room in thin gold strips, falling across the cedar box that had remained closed for years. Outside, Cedar Hollow was already warming beneath a clear June sky. But inside the house the air felt strangely cool. 17 envelopes lay across the coffee table between Margaret and Nathan Cole, arranged from oldest to newest. Sadie rested outside the screen door, her black and tan body stretched along the porch boards, silver muzzle turned toward the room. Margaret had spent the night telling herself there was no reason to open the letters immediately. 11 years had passed. Another day could hardly matter. Yet that excuse had begun to sound ridiculous before sunrise. At 75, Margaret understood that time had a cruel habit of appearing endless, until suddenly there was not enough of it left to postpone anything important. She picked up the first envelope. Nathan sat in the chair nearest the window. He had not suggested staying, and Margaret had not quite asked him to, but neither seemed eager to leave the other alone with what was inside the box. "You don't have to read them aloud," Nathan said. Margaret looked at him. "I know." She opened the envelope carefully. Laura's handwriting was younger then, narrow and controlled, each word leaning slightly to the right. The letter had been mailed less than 2 months after she left Cedar Hollow. Margaret read silently at first. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "What?" Nathan asked. Margaret continued reading. "She says Sadie ate one of her shoes." Nathan glanced toward the German shepherd. Sadie opened one eye. Margaret's mouth twitched despite herself. Apparently the expensive one. For the first time since the collar had been discovered, the room became almost ordinary. The feeling did not last. Laura had written about renting a small apartment in Charleston, taking temporary social work assignments, and learning that Sadie disliked elevators but loved riding in the back seat of a car with her nose against the glass. There was no accusation in the letter, no request for money, no demand that Margaret apologize, only an explanation. Laura wrote that leaving Cedar Hollow had not been an act of punishment. She simply could not remain in a home where silence had repeatedly been treated as loyalty. She loved Margaret, but love did not require agreeing that uncomfortable truths should remain unspoken. Margaret lowered the letter. "She makes me sound cowardly." Nathan did not answer immediately. "Does she?" Margaret looked at him sharply. Nathan held her gaze. "Or does she say she was hurt?" Margaret looked down again. The second letter arrived 4 months later, the third almost a year after that. Laura described new jobs, small apartments, Sadie learning to open certain doors with her nose, and the difficulty of rebuilding a life without the familiar people one had spent years resenting. Occasionally Laura mentioned Cedar Hollow, never with hatred. That surprised Margaret most. For years she had imagined the letters filled with accusations because anger had made that easier. An angry daughter could be dismissed. A daughter still reaching toward her was harder to explain away. The fifth letter contained a photograph. Laura stood beside Sadie outside a modest brick apartment building. She was thinner than Margaret remembered, tall and narrow-shouldered, chestnut hair tied loosely behind her head. Sadie was younger then, perhaps 3, her coat darker, ears alert, body powerful and straight. Laura had one hand resting against the dog's neck and was smiling. Margaret touched the edge of the photograph. She looked like her father when she smiled. Nathan said nothing. There were moments when silence was avoidance, and moments when it was respect. He had spent much of his life confusing the two. By the 8th letter, nearly 5 years had passed. Laura's handwriting had changed slightly. The lines wandered. Some words were crossed out and replaced. She mentioned headaches, appointments, difficulty finding the right word during conversations. She joked that Sadie seemed to understand her unfinished sentences better than most people understood complete ones. Then came the letter dated 7 years after Laura had left Cedar Hollow. Margaret stopped halfway through the first paragraph. Nathan noticed her hand trembling. "What is it?" Margaret read the line again. Laura had suffered a mild stroke. It had not killed her. It had not left her unable to walk. But afterward came neurological problems that doctors could not promise would disappear completely. Her balance became unreliable. Her short-term memory developed gaps. Some mornings language came easily. On others, familiar words seemed to hide just beyond reach. Laura wrote about the humiliation of knowing exactly what she wanted to say while watching someone wait patiently for her to find the words. Margaret's eyes filled, though she refused to wipe them. "I should have known." Nathan looked at the stack of unopened envelopes. "You had the chance to know." The sentence was not cruel. That made it harder. Margaret folded the letter along its old crease. "You seem very comfortable pointing that out." "No," Nathan leaned back. "I'm comfortable recognizing it." His gaze drifted toward the window. During his final deployment, there had been reports before the mission, small inconsistencies. A canine handler had mentioned unusual hesitation during an earlier sweep. Another note suggested the intelligence picture might be incomplete. Nathan had seen those details. He had also believed he understood the larger situation well enough to discount them. Nothing he ignored had seemed decisive on its own. That was how many mistakes were made. Not through cruelty, not because someone wanted harm. Sometimes the most damaging decisions began with the quiet belief that there was nothing more worth hearing. Margaret opened the next letter. Laura had returned to Cedar Hollow. 7 years after leaving, weakened by the stroke and unable to manage entirely alone, she rented a room at Green Haven Rehabilitation Center on the northern edge of town. The facility provided longer-term neurological support, while allowing residents enough independence to move around the grounds and nearby roads. Sadie had changed too. The German Shepherd was no longer simply Laura's companion. Laura had worked with trainers to teach Sadie tasks that helped compensate for what the stroke had taken. Sadie learned to brace herself beside Laura when her balance failed, retrieve dropped objects, guide her back toward familiar landmarks when confusion set in, and interrupt episodes of panic by pressing her body firmly against Laura's legs. Margaret looked through the screen door. Sadie was watching her. The animal suddenly seemed older in a different way, as though the gray around her muzzle represented not merely years, but work. "She took care of her," Margaret whispered. Nathan nodded. "Looks like she still is." The later letters became shorter, the handwriting deteriorated. Sometimes a full page contained only a few paragraphs. Words had been rewritten several times. Dates were occasionally corrected. Laura began mentioning walks with Sadie through northern Cedar Hollow, Mill Creek Road, the park, Hawthorne Street. Margaret's breath caught. Laura had been walking the same route Sadie still walked every afternoon. One letter described reaching the end of Hawthorne Street before turning around. Another said she and Sadie had reached the Baptist church. Months later, Laura wrote that they had stood across from Margaret's house for nearly 15 minutes. Margaret stared at the words. "She was here." Nathan leaned forward. "Not inside," Margaret said, "but here." Laura wrote that she had wanted to climb the porch steps. She had even rehearsed what she might say. Then she became frightened. What if Margaret closed the door? What if 11 years had made forgiveness impossible? What if returning only proved that some distances were easier to survive when measured in miles rather than in words? Each time Laura turned back. Each time Sadie went with her. Margaret placed the letter down and covered her mouth. For years she had told people that Laura abandoned her. The truth now sat in 17 envelopes. Laura had continued writing. Laura had returned to Cedar Hollow. Laura had repeatedly walked toward home. Margaret had been the one who never opened anything. Nathan looked at her but did not offer comfort she had not asked for. People often imagined regret as a dramatic punishment, something loud and unmistakable. More often it arrived quietly, in an ordinary room, through evidence that had been within reach all along. Only one envelope remained. The handwriting on the final letter was visibly unsteady. Margaret opened it slowly. Laura wrote that speaking had become more difficult and that some days she lost pieces of the morning before lunch. Sadie remained patient. Sadie still knew the roads even when Laura became confused. Near the bottom was a final paragraph. Margaret read it once, then again. Her voice broke when she finally read aloud. Sadie still remembers the way home. Maybe one day I'll be brave enough to walk the whole road with her. Nathan looked toward the dog outside. Sadie had risen. Margaret turned the page over. At the bottom was the return address, Green Haven Rehabilitation Center, North Cedar Hollow. Nathan recognized the road immediately. The park, Mill Creek Road, the old service lane, the same direction Sadie traveled every afternoon. Margaret stared through the screen door at the old German Shepherd. For days, everyone had believed Sadie was leaving the house and going somewhere mysterious. Now Margaret understood they had been looking at the journey backward. Sadie had not been searching for a destination. She had been retracing the road Laura once tried to walk home. The next morning came warm and unusually still over Cedar Hollow, West Virginia, with a pale June sun rising above the wooded hills and mist lingering low along Mill Creek Road. Margaret Ellis had been awake long before breakfast. The 17 opened letters remained scattered across her dining table, no longer protected by envelopes or the stories she had invented around them. By 8, she was dressed in a light blue cardigan over a cream blouse, her silver-gray hair carefully combed, a canvas church tote hanging from one hand. She had changed clothes twice before settling on that outfit, then become irritated with herself for caring. Nathan Cole arrived without knocking loudly. At 47, the former Navy SEAL looked much as he always did. Tall, broad-shouldered, short dark brown hair graying at the temples, neatly trimmed beard, controlled hazel eyes. But Margaret noticed that he had left his truck at home. Sadie was already standing at the gate. "We follow her," Nathan said. Margaret looked toward the German Shepherd. "Apparently everyone in this town has decided she's in charge." Nathan almost smiled. "She's had a good week." Sadie started walking before Margaret could object. For the first time, Margaret traveled the route she had watched from behind curtains. Hawthorne Street gave way to the Little Baptist Church, Cedar Hollow Park, the library, and then Mill Creek Road. Sadie moved slowly enough for Margaret, occasionally looking back to make sure both humans remained behind her. The stiffness in the old dog's hind legs was more obvious over distance, but her direction never wavered. Margaret began to recognize places mentioned in Laura's letters. The pharmacy, the service lane, the curve where the road narrowed beneath trees. Each landmark made the letters feel less like things written by a distant daughter and more like footprints Margaret had refused to see. "She walked all this?" Margaret asked. "More than once," Nathan said. Margaret looked at Sadie's aging back. "And I was sitting 3 miles away." Nathan did not tell her there had been no way to know. That would have been kind, perhaps, but it would not have been true. She had possessed 17 opportunities to know. Green Haven Rehabilitation Center stood at the northern edge of Cedar Hollow, behind a line of dogwoods and mature oaks. It was a low brick building with wide windows, a covered entrance, and flower beds maintained with more care than imagination. Sadie stopped at the driveway. Margaret's breathing changed. Nathan noticed but said nothing. The German Shepherd crossed the parking lot and went straight to the main doors. A woman emerged before they reached them. Her name was Renee Walsh, a 58-year-old senior care coordinator with a sturdy build, warm brown skin, short salt and pepper curls, and dark eyes that seemed to notice emotional changes before spoken ones. Renee had worked at Green Haven for 14 years. He spoke gently, without being overly sweet, a trait learned from years around people who could immediately detect when pity had entered someone's voice. The moment Renee saw Sadie, relief crossed her face. "Oh, thank God," she crouched. "Where have you been, old girl?" Sadie allowed Renee to touch her neck, but kept looking toward the building. Margaret stepped forward. "You know her?" Renee looked up. "Everyone here knows Sadie." Nathan and Margaret exchanged a glance. "My name is Margaret Ellis," Renee's expression changed. Not shock, recognition. Laura's mother. Margaret seemed to shrink slightly beneath those two words. She's here? Renee stood slowly. Yes. Margaret closed her eyes. Nathan had imagined relief might appear first. Instead, there was fear. For 11 years, Margaret had lived with absence. Absence was painful but predictable. A living daughter behind those doors created possibilities, and possibilities could wound in new ways. Renee led them into a quiet consultation room, while Sadie remained beside Margaret's chair. There, the missing years became clearer. Laura had returned to Cedar Hollow 4 years earlier, after neurological problems following her first stroke made independent living increasingly difficult. At first, she lived in one of Greenhaven's transitional apartments and could still walk into town with support. Sadie had been trained to steady Laura when her balance failed, guide her toward familiar landmarks when confusion set in, and interrupt panic by leaning firmly against her legs. Then, 3 years ago, Laura suffered a second stroke. She recovered physically better than we expected, Renee explained, but her memory changed significantly. Laura could still read simple passages, hold conversations, dress herself with reminders, and recognize familiar objects. But people and chronology had become unreliable. Some days she remembered events from childhood with startling detail, but could not recall what she had eaten an hour earlier. Names disappeared. Relationships became disconnected from faces. Margaret stared at her hands. Does she know she has a mother? Sometimes. That answer hurt more than no would have. Renee told them about Helen Parker, the woman who had become Laura's closest caregiver. Helen had been 69 when she died 6 weeks earlier. A tall, narrow woman with cropped white hair, long hands, and the stubborn patience of a retired elementary school teacher. After losing her husband, Helen had returned to part-time care work because, as she liked to say, retirement provided far too many opportunities to organize drawers. She and Laura developed a quiet friendship. Helen took Laura and Sadie on supervised walks around Cedar Hollow whenever Laura felt strong enough. Toward Hawthorne Street? Nathan asked. Renee nodded. Often. Margaret's eyes closed again. After Helen's sudden death from a heart condition, Sadie became restless. The dog began pacing near the doors, scratching at the courtyard gate, and repeatedly trying to leave. Staff assumed she was searching for Helen or responding to Laura's distress. 1 week before Sadie appeared on Margaret's porch, she escaped through a service gate left partially open during landscaping work. We searched everywhere, Renee said. We called shelters, posted notices. We thought she was lost. Nathan looked down at Sadie. She wasn't. Renee followed his gaze. No, I suppose she wasn't. Sadie had gone exactly where Laura had spent years trying to reach. Margaret asked to see her daughter. Renee did not promise that Laura would recognize her. The room was on the ground floor overlooking a shaded courtyard. Laura Ellis sat beside the window folding clean washcloths into precise squares. At 50, she still carried traces of the younger woman in Margaret's photographs. Laura was tall even while seated, though her frame had grown fragile and her shoulders curved slightly forward. Her chestnut hair was now threaded heavily with silver and cut just above her shoulders. Her skin was pale, her face narrow, and her gray-blue eyes remained striking, but sometimes seemed focused on something several seconds behind the present moment. Sadie entered first. Laura's face changed immediately. "There you are," she whispered. Sadie went straight to her and placed her head against Laura's knee. Margaret stopped near the doorway. For years she had imagined this moment in different forms: anger, tears, accusation, perhaps forgiveness if she was lucky enough to deserve it. She had never imagined being a stranger. Laura looked at her politely. "Hello." Margaret's lips trembled. "Laura." Laura studied her face. Nothing came. Margaret stepped closer. "It's me." Laura glanced toward Renee, then back at Margaret. "Are you the lady with the clean towels?" The question entered the room softly. Margaret seemed to lose her balance without moving. "No," she said. Laura smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry. They change people sometimes." Nathan turned his eyes toward the window. He understood that certain pain became more humiliating when witnessed directly. Margaret sat in a chair across from Laura. She did not tell her everything. She did not demand recognition. For nearly 20 minutes they spoke about ordinary things: the weather, Sadie, the flowers outside. Laura lost the thread twice and asked Nathan his name 3 times. Each time he answered as though it were the first. When Margaret finally stood to leave, she looked exhausted in a way Nathan had never seen. He walked beside her toward the door, but offered no comforting promise, no "she'll remember," no "give it time." Some truths deserved more respect than optimism. Margaret reached for the canvas tote she had placed beside her chair. Laura's eyes followed the faded bag. She frowned. "Wait." Margaret turned. Laura pointed toward the tote. "My mother had one like that." Margaret did not breathe. Laura touched her own chest as if searching through a room in darkness. "She carried it to church." Margaret's eyes filled. Laura still looked at her without recognition. But something had moved. Sadie stood between the 2 women and looked from one face to the other. Then her old tail struck the floor once. And again. The days that followed settled into a strange new rhythm beneath the warm June skies of Cedar Hollow. Margaret Ellis went to Greenhaven every morning, carrying the same faded canvas church tote that had stirred something inside Laura on their first meeting. Some days Laura greeted her politely and allowed Margaret to sit beside the window while Sadie slept between their chairs. On better mornings, Laura spoke about small things: a hymn she remembered from childhood, the smell of cinnamon rolls, the way rain used to collect beneath the gutter of an old house she could no longer place. On other days, Laura turned her face toward the courtyard and asked Renee to tell the unfamiliar woman that she was tired. Margaret learned not to correct her. That was harder than it sounded. For 11 years she had wanted a chance to explain herself. Now she had the chance to speak and was discovering that love sometimes required keeping explanations to oneself. One morning, Laura looked directly at her and said, "You have my mother's hands." Margaret lowered her eyes to the thin blue veins beneath her skin. What were her hands like? Laura thought for a long time. "Always busy." Margaret almost laughed. Instead, she said, "That sounds about right." She stopped measuring progress by whether Laura called her mom. Some forms of hope became destructive when treated like a test. If Laura smiled when Margaret arrived, that was enough. If she did not, Margaret stayed anyway. Sadie seemed to understand that lesson before anyone else. After the first visit, Renee had expected the German Shepherd to remain at Greenhaven with Laura. Sadie did stay through most of the day, resting beneath Laura's window or beside her chair, but each afternoon the old dog became restless at nearly the same time. At 4:15, she would rise, walk toward the main corridor and stop near the doors. The first time it happened, Nathan was there. Sadie looked at him. "You're serious?" Her tail moved once. Renee crossed her arms. "I'm not letting an elderly dog wander 3 miles through town by herself again." Nathan clipped a leash loosely to Sadie's collar. "I think she'll tolerate supervision." Sadie gave him a look suggesting tolerance was precisely the word. They walked. Greenhaven to Mill Creek Road past the old pharmacy, through the park, past the Baptist church, then Hawthorne Street. Sadie did not stop at Greenhaven's gate, wondering where to go. She did not wander toward food or unfamiliar dogs. Every afternoon she returned to Margaret's porch. Sometimes Margaret was already there. Then, after several minutes, Sadie turned around and walked back toward Greenhaven with Nathan. At first, Nathan believed the behavior was simple repetition. Dogs remembered routines, especially dogs trained to support someone with neurological problems. But something bothered him. Sadie was repeating a journey that no longer seemed necessary. Margaret already knew where Laura was. Laura had been found. The connection had been made. Yet Sadie continued. Nathan began to suspect that they had misunderstood the purpose of the journey. He asked Renee whether Helen Parker had left any notes about Laura's walks. "She documented nearly everything," Renee said. "Helen believed memory care worked better when people's routines were treated as meaningful instead of inconvenient." In a storage cabinet near the staff office were several folders containing old walking logs, therapy notes, and observations Helen had kept during the years she cared for Laura. Nathan did not read medical information he had no right to see. Renee pulled only the entries concerning Sadie and the supervised walks, with Margaret's permission as Laura's closest family member. The pattern emerged slowly. 3 years earlier, before Laura's second stroke worsened her condition, Helen had taken Laura and Sadie walking several times each week. Many walks were short. Others followed the route toward Hawthorne Street. One entry read, "Laura requested old neighborhood, reached church, became anxious, returned." Another, weeks later, reached Hawthorne. Laura stood across from family home for 11 minutes, said tomorrow she would go to the porch. A later entry said, "Reached front gate." Laura cried. Sadie remained beside her. Laura said, "Tomorrow." Nathan read the word again, tomorrow. There were more. "Tomorrow I'll knock. Tomorrow I'll speak to her. Tomorrow I won't turn around." But tomorrow kept becoming another walk home. Margaret sat beside Nathan as Renee read the entries aloud. Her expression changed with each one. "So she came that close?" Renee nodded. "Several times." Margaret looked through the window toward Sadie, who was lying beside Laura in the courtyard. "She could see the house?" "Yes." "And she never came up the steps?" "No." Margaret's first emotion was pain. Her second was almost anger. She was right there. Nathan looked at her. Margaret hurt herself. The anger disappeared. For 11 years, she had blamed Laura for leaving. Now she was almost blaming her for failing to return correctly. Human beings had an astonishing talent for moving responsibility to wherever it hurt least. Margaret leaned back. "No," she said quietly. "That isn't fair." Nathan said nothing. "She was afraid I would shut the door." Renee closed the folder. Margaret's voice became thinner. "And she had reason to think I might." Sadie's afternoon journeys suddenly made sense. After Helen died, there was no one left to take Laura down the route she had repeated for years. After the second stroke, Laura could no longer make the walk safely or reliably remember why she wanted to. Sadie could. The German Shepherd had completed the part Laura never managed. She had walked all the way to the porch, and then she had waited for Margaret. Not because the dog expected Laura to arrive behind her, because Sadie had brought Laura's unfinished act to the only person who could finish it from the other side. Nathan felt something tighten in his chest. He had once believed leadership meant moving first, giving instructions, making decisions before uncertainty had time to spread. Sadie had done almost the opposite. She had carried a direction, then waited. That afternoon, Nathan found an email waiting on his phone from a regional veterans rehabilitation program outside Charleston. Months earlier, an old teammate had submitted his name without telling him. The program paired veterans struggling with reintegration and anxiety with trained therapy and companion dogs. They wanted Nathan to join as an instructor and mentor. He read the invitation twice, then began typing a refusal. He deleted it, started again, deleted that too. Margaret was sitting on her porch when he returned from Greenhaven. "You're wearing the face," she said. Nathan stopped. "What face?" "The one men wear when they've already made a bad decision but want another hour to pretend they haven't." Nathan looked at her. "That specific?" "I was married 46 years. He showed her the message. Margaret read it. "You're going to say no." "Probably." "Why?" Nathan looked across the street rather than at her. "I'm not the person they think I am." Margaret handed the phone back. "That sounds convenient." Nathan's jaw tightened. "You know what happened?" "Yes." "You know I ignored a warning?" "Yes." "A man got hurt?" "Yes." "The dog lost its career?" "Yes." Nathan turned toward her. "You're not very good at comforting people." "I've recently learned that telling people what makes them comfortable can become expensive." That silenced him. Margaret folded her hands. "Guilt can look very much like humility, Nathan. You tell yourself you're stepping aside because you know your limitations. Sometimes you're really just making sure you never have to risk being responsible again." Nathan stared at her. Margaret looked toward Sadie. "I know because I did it for 11 years. She had not intended to say that much. Neither of them tried to soften it afterward. 2 days later, Nathan accompanied Sadie on the afternoon walk and noticed her hesitate at a corner she had crossed dozens of times. She turned left, then stopped. The correct route was right. Nathan waited. Sadie looked around, visibly uncertain. After several seconds, she corrected herself and continued. The mistake was small, but Nathan remembered it. He also noticed that Sadie took longer to stand after resting and occasionally dragged one rear paw on uphill sections. Renee arranged an examination with Greenhaven's visiting veterinarian, Dr. Ellen Brooks. Ellen was 46, tall and lean, with auburn hair pulled into a practical ponytail, lightly freckled skin, and rectangular glasses that she constantly pushed higher with one finger. She spoke plainly, especially with older pet owners, because years in veterinary medicine had taught her that false reassurance rarely became kindness later. She examined Sadie's hips, spine, reflexes, gait, vision, and responses to simple orientation tasks. Margaret, Nathan, and Renee waited. Ellen finally rested one hand gently against Sadie's shoulder. "She has advanced degenerative arthritis in both hips." Margaret looked down. "But that isn't all," Ellen continued. "There were early signs consistent with canine cognitive decline, confusion at familiar turns, changes in routine, brief disorientation, increased difficulty navigating as the condition progressed." Nathan thought about the wrong turn. Margaret thought about the miles between Greenhaven and Hawthorne Street. "How long?" Margaret asked. Ellen shook her head. "There isn't a precise clock." Sadie stood beside them, calm as ever. Margaret lowered herself carefully and touched the silver fur around the dog's face. For weeks they had believed Sadie was the one creature in the story who remembered everything. Now memory was beginning to loosen its hold on her too. And still, every afternoon, the old German shepherd had walked the road Laura could no longer finish. Sadie had been carrying someone else's way home while slowly beginning to lose her own. The morning Margaret brought Laura home, Cedar Hollow was bright beneath a soft summer sky. The kind of June morning that made ordinary things appear newly washed. The hills beyond town were deep green, the roadside wildflowers had opened after several days of warmth, and the air carried the faint sweetness of honeysuckle from the ditches along Mill Creek Road. Margaret had been awake since before sunrise, though she told herself she had slept. At 75, she had learned that there were nights when lying still beneath a blanket was close enough. She had cleaned the house twice, changed the sheets in Laura's old bedroom, dusted picture frames that had not been touched in months, and then, after standing in the hallway for several minutes, removed 3 photographs from the mantel because she suddenly feared that too many familiar faces might feel like strangers staring at Laura. It was the first time Margaret truly understood how easily love could become pressure when fear was allowed to disguise itself as preparation. Greenhaven approved the visit after Laura's physician reviewed the plan. Laura could spend several hours at the house, but only if Nathan and a medical aide accompanied her, and only if everyone agreed that the visit would end immediately if she became exhausted or distressed. The aide assigned to them was Rachel Monroe, a 38-year-old rehabilitation nurse with a compact, athletic build, warm brown skin, dark hair braided neatly against the back of her head, and calm green-brown eyes that seemed difficult to hurry. Rachel had worked in neurological rehabilitation for 11 years. She was practical, observant, and careful never to speak to adults with memory problems as though confusion had made them children. Years earlier, her own father had suffered a brain injury after a construction accident, and watching relatives talk around him instead of to him had shaped the way Rachel treated every patient afterward. "You don't have to make today meaningful," Rachel told Margaret before they left Greenhaven. It already is. Margaret frowned. That sounds suspiciously like advice. It is. I was afraid of that. Nathan, standing nearby, looked away to hide a smile. Sadie waited by the front walkway. The 9-year-old German shepherd had been moving more slowly since Dr. Brooks examined her. Her hindquarters were stiff, and Nathan had begun noticing moments when she paused at familiar corners, as if the road needed to introduce itself again. But when Laura emerged from Greenhaven, Sadie's entire posture changed. The old dog lifted her head, ears alert, and moved to Laura's side. Laura was wearing a pale green blouse and loose gray trousers. At 50, she remained tall, though neurological illness and years of reduced activity had softened the once straight line of her shoulders. Chestnut hair streaked heavily with silver framed her narrow face. Her gray-blue eyes moved carefully over the parking lot, sometimes settling on details with deep concentration, and sometimes passing over familiar things without recognition. "Are we going somewhere?" Laura asked. Margaret stood beside her. "Yes." Laura studied her. "Do I know you?" Margaret's chest tightened. She could have said, "I'm your mother." Instead, she answered, "My name is Margaret. I'm going with you." Laura considered this, then nodded. "Okay." There were forms of progress no one applauded because they looked too much like restraint. Sadie started walking. Because of the dog's arthritis and Laura's limited endurance, Rachel insisted they take frequent breaks. Nathan had offered to drive everyone, but Margaret asked whether they could follow part of the old route on foot. "Not the whole way," Rachel warned. Margaret nodded. They walked the final stretch from Cedar Hollow Park toward Hawthorne Street. Sadie led. For weeks, Margaret had waited at the end of that road. Now she walked beside the dog. The difference seemed small until she experienced it. At every corner, Sadie paused long enough to confirm that Laura remained behind her. When the sidewalk narrowed, the German shepherd moved closer to Laura's left side, where years of training had taught her to brace if Laura lost balance. Nathan stayed several paces back. His instincts disliked that position. For most of his life, he had led from the front. He assessed danger, planned movement, established pace. Even after leaving the Navy, he still felt an urge to correct uncertain situations before uncertainty could grow. But each time Nathan considered moving closer, he remembered Sadie sitting 6 feet from him on the northern road while his breathing returned. She had not crowded him. She had waited. So Nathan waited too. Margaret's house appeared at the end of Hawthorne Street. Laura slowed. Sadie stopped. For a moment, no one spoke. Laura stared at the porch. Her expression did not change dramatically, but Rachel noticed her fingers begin rubbing together. "Do you want to keep going?" Rachel asked. Laura looked at Sadie. The German shepherd took 3 slow steps toward the gate. Laura followed. Margaret did not touch her. The front door stood open. Inside, the living room looked almost painfully ordinary. Pale curtains, wooden furniture, a vase of hydrangeas. Margaret had imagined Laura crossing the threshold and suddenly recognizing everything. Instead, Laura stepped inside and looked around politely. "Pretty house." Margaret's face changed. Nathan saw the disappointment before she hid it. "Thank you," Margaret said. Laura walked toward the mantel. She picked up one framed photograph showing herself at perhaps 17 beside her parents. She examined it. "Who are they?" Margaret swallowed. "That was taken a long time ago." Laura placed it back. No miracle arrived. No rush of memories repaired 11 years. The house had preserved Laura's past far better than Laura's mind had. They moved into the hallway. Then Laura saw the stairs. She stopped so suddenly that Sadie nearly bumped into her. Laura's breathing quickened. "No." Rachel stepped closer but did not touch her. "That's okay." "No." Laura backed away. "There's something wrong." Margaret instinctively moved toward her. "Laura, this was your—" Nathan raised one hand slightly. Margaret stopped. The old Margaret might have continued. She might have insisted that facts should defeat fear. This is your house. That is your room. You are safe. Nathan understood why she wanted to say those things. He also understood that a frightened mind did not become less frightened because someone louder supplied correct information. Sadie walked into the middle of the hallway. Then she lay down. The German Shepherd rested her head on her paws and waited. Laura watched her. 1 minute passed. Then another. Nobody told Laura to move. Rachel leaned against the wall. Nathan stayed near the doorway. Margaret stood with both hands clasped tightly before her, fighting the urge to rescue the moment. 5 minutes earlier, she had wanted Laura to remember. Now she only wanted Laura not to suffer. That difference mattered. Sadie lifted her head. Laura took 1 step forward, then another. At the foot of the staircase, she stopped again. Sadie remained on the floor. Laura looked down at her. "You're not coming?" Sadie's tail moved once. Something almost like irritation crossed Laura's face. "Well, that's helpful." Nathan laughed quietly. Laura looked at him, surprised, then smiled. The tension broke just enough. She placed 1 hand on the railing, then lifted her foot onto the first stair. No one celebrated. That would have turned courage into performance. They simply followed. Laura's old bedroom remained at the end of the second-floor hallway. Margaret had changed almost nothing over the years. The bed frame was the same white-painted wood. A narrow bookshelf stood beneath the window. The curtains had faded from blue to gray. Laura entered slowly. She touched the desk. Nothing. She opened the wardrobe. Nothing. Then her eyes settled on a small wooden music box on the shelf. It was carved in the shape of a nightingale perched on a branch, the varnish worn pale around the wings. Laura picked it up. Her fingers hesitated over the brass key. Margaret stopped breathing. "My father bought that when Laura was 6, she said quietly to Rachel. Laura turned the key. The mechanism clicked. A simple melody filled the room. Laura froze. The change in her face was subtle at first. Her eyebrows drew together. Her lips parted. She sat on the edge of the bed. "I know this." Margaret's eyes filled. Laura listened. "I don't know why." "That's all right," Margaret whispered. Laura looked at her. "Someone played this at night." Margaret nodded. "Yes." "A woman?" "Yes." Laura pressed the box against her palm. "She sat there." She pointed toward the edge of the bed. Margaret's voice almost failed. "She did." Laura looked at Margaret for a long time. She did not say, "Mom." She did not suddenly recognize the woman before her. But there was less distance in her eyes. Sadie entered the bedroom and lowered herself beside Laura's feet. Laura looked down, then slowly slid from the bed to sit on the floor. She placed 1 hand on Sadie's head. The old German Shepherd closed her eyes. Laura stroked the silver fur around her muzzle. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You brought me home." Margaret sat down beside her daughter, not too close, not demanding touch, not asking whether Laura remembered the argument, the letters, or the years between them. Nathan remained near the doorway. For the first time, he understood leadership in a way no training manual had ever taught him. Sometimes the person at the front could become the obstacle. Sometimes helping meant removing your hands from the outcome. In the quiet bedroom, the music box played until the melody slowed and stopped. Laura remained on the floor beside Sadie. Margaret remained beside Laura. No one demanded forgiveness. No one asked memory to perform another miracle. And for the first time in 11 years, 3 lives that had been separated by fear were inside the same room. None of them was trying to leave. By late August, Cedar Hollow had begun to soften toward the end of summer. The hills remained green, but the mornings arrived cooler, and the first dry leaves had begun collecting beneath the maples along Hawthorne Street. Laura had been transferred from Greenhaven's main neurological unit to a smaller, assisted care residence operated by the same organization, on the south side of town, less than 15 minutes from Margaret's house. The move did not restore anything that illness had taken. Laura still woke some mornings knowing Margaret's name, and other mornings greeting her with the careful politeness reserved for strangers. What changed was Margaret. She stopped arriving with questions disguised as conversation. She no longer asked, "Do you remember this?" or "Do you know who I am?" She had finally understood how cruel a simple question could become when every answer was treated as a test. Instead, Margaret brought tea, folded laundry beside Laura, read aloud from old magazines, and sometimes sat for 40 minutes without saying anything at all. On good days, Laura called her Mom. On difficult days, she called her the lady with the blue sweater. Margaret learned to answer to both. Sadie lived with Margaret now. The arrangement had happened without ceremony. Margaret brought the German Shepherd home one evening after Dr. Brooks explained that the long walks between facilities were becoming too demanding for her arthritic hips. Margaret placed a thick orthopedic bed beside the front window, 2 water bowls in different rooms so Sadie would never have far to walk, and a rubber-backed rug through the hallway where the polished floor had become slippery beneath aging paws. She then informed Nathan that none of this meant she had become one of those people who organize their lives around a dog. Nathan looked at the ramp newly installed beside the porch steps and wisely said nothing. Sadie's black and tan coat remained handsome, though silver now surrounded most of her muzzle, and the once powerful rear legs had lost muscle. Some mornings she stood easily. On others, Margaret slid one arm beneath her abdomen and helped without making a fuss. Sadie still visited Laura several times a week. The moment the German Shepherd entered the care residence, Laura's expression often changed before recognition had time to form. She might forget Sadie's name, but her hand would automatically lower toward the familiar head. The Nightingale music box came too. Margaret had placed it beside Laura's bed after receiving permission from the staff. Some afternoons Laura turned the brass key herself, other times Margaret did it. The melody never restored a complete memory. There was no miraculous morning when Laura suddenly remembered every birthday, every Christmas, every argument, every year lost between them. But the songs seemed to reach somewhere ordinary language could not. Whenever it played, Laura often searched beside her chair until she found Margaret's hand. Once, while the melody slowed toward its final notes, Laura asked, "Were you there when I was little?" Margaret's throat tightened. "Yes." Laura studied her face. "Was I difficult?" Margaret almost laughed, spectacularly. Laura smiled. "Good." That was enough. Nathan's life changed more quietly. The invitation from the Veterans Rehabilitation Program remained unanswered on his phone for nearly 2 weeks before he finally accepted. His first days there were more uncomfortable than he expected. The program paired former service members with trained therapy and companion dogs, but Nathan refused the easy role of the veteran who had survived everything and now possessed wisdom for everyone else. He told the staff directly that he had made mistakes with working dogs before. He did not explain every detail. He simply stopped pretending expertise required certainty. During training sessions, he began asking veterans what they noticed before telling them what he noticed. If a dog hesitated, Nathan did not immediately label the behavior stubbornness, distraction, or fear. He watched. He waited. He asked what might have been missed. The change seemed small from the outside. To Nathan, it was almost a new language. One afternoon, Margaret asked whether he liked the work. "I don't know yet." She nodded approvingly. Nathan raised an eyebrow. "That's encouraging." "You used to know everything." "I did not. You sounded like you did." Occupational hazard. Margaret poured coffee. "You're improving," Nathan laughed. Margaret's own work was quieter. The 17 letters no longer sat inside the cedar box as evidence against her. She returned to them slowly, reading passages she had rushed through when fear had driven her to search only for answers about Laura's whereabouts. Now she read them to understand the daughter behind the handwriting. She learned which apartment Laura hated because the pipes rattled. She learned Sadie once stole an entire loaf of bread and hid half beneath a sofa cushion. She learned Laura had almost called Margaret on her 69th birthday and sat with the phone number entered for 20 minutes before deleting it. Margaret did not read those details to punish herself. Regret had already taken enough. She read because Laura had spent years trying to speak, and Margaret had finally decided that listening should not end simply because the letters had already been opened. By the final days of August, Sadie no longer attempted the old afternoon route. At 4:15 she sometimes lifted her head, as though some internal clock still rang faintly. Then she looked toward Hawthorne Street, sighed, and settled again. One cool morning, Margaret opened the front door and found Sadie lying in her old position on the porch. For an instant, the sight brought back that first June morning. But everything was different. Sadie was facing outward now, not toward the doorway, toward the road. Behind her, Margaret had left the front door open. There was nothing left for Sadie to request. Laura had been found. Margaret had crossed the road from pride to responsibility. Nathan had begun moving forward again. The unfinished journey had finally become something other than unfinished. Margaret lowered herself beside the dog and rested a hand against the thick fur behind her ears. "You can stop waiting," she whispered. Sadie did not look at her. Her tail moved once against the boards. A few weeks later, Dr. Brooks told Margaret that Sadie's body was becoming tired faster than it could recover. There was no dramatic crisis, no desperate race against time. Sadie simply became weaker, slept longer, and eventually stopped showing interest in the porch or the road. On one quiet afternoon, Laura was brought to Margaret's house. She sat in the living room with Sadie's head resting across her legs. Margaret sat beside them, one hand moving slowly over the German shepherd's back. Laura looked down at the old dog. "Is she mine?" Margaret answered carefully, "She loves you." Laura seemed satisfied with that. Sadie remained surrounded by the two women she had spent years trying to bring together. Later, she died peacefully. Margaret cried. Laura cried too, though minutes later she could not explain exactly why. Nathan stood outside on the porch for a long time before coming inside. No one called Sadie's death a miracle. The miracle, if such a word belonged anywhere, had happened much earlier. It had happened when an aging dog remembered a road, when she refused to leave a porch, when she waited longer than the people involved had been willing to wait for one another. Winter passed. By early spring, new leaves were opening along Hawthorne Street. One mild morning, Laura sat on Margaret's porch wrapped in a light cardigan. Her health had stabilized, though her memory remained unpredictable. Margaret brought 2 cups of tea and sat nearby. Laura noticed a shallow, worn place in the porch boards near the door, smooth and slightly darker where an old dog had spent countless hours lying. She touched it. What happened here? Margaret looked at the mark. A friend used to lie there. Laura ran her fingertips across the wood. Why? Margaret considered giving her the whole story. Instead, she smiled. She waited there a very long time for us to stop being angry with each other. Laura frowned, as though searching for a memory that would not come. Was she a good friend? The best. Laura kept her hand on the worn board for another moment. Then she looked at Margaret. She did not say, "Mom." "Would you like to sit here with me?" Margaret placed the tea beside them and lowered herself onto the porch. "Yes," she said, "I would." They sat shoulder to shoulder beneath the mild spring sun. Neither woman spoke about the 11 missing years. Neither demanded forgiveness from the other. Neither promised that Laura would remember this morning tomorrow. The door behind them remained open, and for that morning at least, neither woman chose to leave. Maybe the miracle in this story was never that Sadie remembered the road. Maybe it was that she kept walking it when the people she loved had forgotten how to reach one another. We often think broken relationships are healed by one perfect apology, one recovered memory, or one dramatic moment. Real life is rarely that simple. Pride can keep a door closed for years. Guilt can convince us we no longer deserve another chance. And sometimes we spend so much time defending what we did yesterday that we lose the chance to love someone today. Sadie could not erase Margaret's mistakes or restore everything illness had taken from Laura. She simply kept showing them the way back. Perhaps God's miracles sometimes look like that. Not thunder from heaven, but a faithful companion, an open door, a softened heart, and one more opportunity to choose love over pride. If this story touched you, share it with someone who may need that reminder. Tell us in the comments who you would still open the door for, and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, grace, and second chances. May God bless your home, protect those you love, and give you courage to open the doors that still can be opened.